Welcome to Knock Talk. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac from his own personal Holy Land in Canada. Where in the wintertime it's colder, and in the summertime it's older. Don't even ask. I have no idea where that just came from. But I'm glad you're here. That may be my new saying from now on. Who knows? Rabbi, it's
pleasure. It's going to be on the license. They're going to put that on license plates of the cars here now.
That's funny. Wow, it's good to have you back, Rabbi. How are you?
Good to be here with you.
Very
Baruch
nice.
Hashem. Thank God.
Indeed. Baruch Hashem. So tonight, your title for tonight is the New Testament Jew hatred. It has to do with anti-Semitism. It has to do with the idea of being anti-Semitic altogether, and it's all seems to be really magnified in this chapter. So I'm looking forward to what you have to teach us on this.
Okay, so First Thessalonians chapter 2, and we'll begin with verse 2. Where Paul says something that he actually repeats 4 times in this chapter. He says here in verse 2, he repeats it in verses 8 and 9 and 13, that he is preaching the gospel of God. He makes this point 4 times. It's quite amazing. He emphasizes this, that this is not his own teaching. He says this is the teaching of God. This is the message of God. And, the obvious question is, what's the proof? Which is a legitimate question. How do we know that this is actually what God is intending for us to hear? The truth is that these revelations that Paul is transmitting are not public revelations. Again, we know that the revelation at Mount Sinai was public. It was heard by 3 million people. And there was no one that heard God communicating with Paul. Absolutely no one. These are Paul's private, personal experiences, allegedly experiences, meaning at best they are his personal experiences. They could be just things that he makes up. But he may certainly have believed that God spoke to him. He certainly may have believed that, but the truth is that so do all false prophets. Every false prophet believes that they are a true prophet. And so the $64,000 question here is, how do we know that this is the gospel of God? Is it just because Paul says so? Is this just Paul's assertion, his claim? And that this is only where his problems begin. Because we know that in God's scriptures, in the Torah, which are indisputably from God, God gives us the mechanism by which we are able to determine whether or not someone is a true prophet. And again, God did not say a person is established as a true prophet because they claim to be a true prophet. And God does not say that a person can be qualified as and known to be a true prophet because God himself will reveal to us, will tell us that the person is a true prophet. Those are 2 possibilities. The third possibility is that God has enshrined in the Torah the mechanism where he says in Deuteronomy chapter 17, the leading sages, the leading judges of any generation, they have to make the decision whether or not someone is a true prophet or a false prophet. Now, in Deuteronomy 17, it doesn't speak specifically about the question of someone being a true or false prophet, but it's very clearly speaking there about any situation when a question arises where it's a capital situation, meaning where if the person is guilty, they can be put to death. And we know that in the Bible, false prophets can be put to death. And so whether or not someone is a true prophet or a false prophet, this is a serious question. And again, how do we know whether the person is a true prophet or not? So again, it's not decided by how much the person insists they're a true prophet. And God does not tell us that what he will do to make sure that we know the person is a true prophet is that God will come down from heaven and he will tell us that the person's a true prophet. God says that you will go to the leading judges and they will tell you the decision. And so Paul was never accepted as a legitimate prophet by the leading sages of his generation. Paul claims to have studied with one of the leading sages of that generation, Rabbi Gamliel, but Paul was never accepted for sure as a legitimate prophet. And one of the reasons is that prophecy actually ended about 400 years prior to this, meaning that 400 years before the first century, there's no more prophecy in Israel, and it will only be restored when the true Messiah has come. And then finally, we know that there's a problem with Paul's teachings because Paul contradicts Scripture in so many different ways. We're not going to go through all of them now, just a few examples, but this is another way in which we can clinch the idea that Paul is not a true prophet. For example, in the book of Romans chapter 11, he basically misquotes Scripture. He misquotes Isaiah chapter 59, and he doesn't misquote it in an innocent way. He misquotes it and distorts it in a very, very serious way so that it's saying something completely against what the original text says. We know that in Galatians chapter 2, verse 21, Paul takes the position that it is not possible to observe God's commandments. He basically reiterates this in Romans many times. Paul basically says that it's not possible for us to observe, to keep God's commandments. He says if it were possible, then Jesus died in vain. So Paul says it's not possible, and yet God himself in the Torah, in Deuteronomy chapter 30, God says that it is possible to keep the commandments. Not just that it's possible, he says it's not too hard to do. You can do it, God says. We see that throughout Paul's writings, he denigrates the commandments. He denigrates the Torah. He speaks about them as a ministry of death engraved on stone. He speaks of them as ordinances that are against you. He speaks of them always in a very negative way. And yet in the Tanakh, in God's scriptures, we see throughout the Bible, Psalm chapter 19, Psalm chapter 119, that the scriptures speak about the commandments in the most glowing, exalted terms that you can imagine. We see throughout Paul's writings, there's an element of replacement theology, that somehow all the Jewish people will no longer be considered God's chosen people. They're going to be basically replaced by Gentiles that come to believe in Jesus. And this goes against God's promise to Israel, to the people of Israel, that they will be his beloved people, his chosen people forever and ever. So we see, and there are many, many other places where Paul just basically contradicts the word of God. And so he cannot be a true prophet. And therefore, when he claims that his message is the message, the gospel, the teaching of God, we know that it's not true. Now, I want to look at now a block of verses. I'm not going to read them, just refer to them. But starting in verse 3 and going all the way to verse 12, Paul does something here that he actually does several times in his writings. It's unfortunately something that he has a habit of doing. And it's something that no real prophet of God would ever do. We don't see any of the prophets in the Tanakh doing what Paul repeatedly does in his writings. He basically takes a line from Shakespeare's Macbeth, "Methinks the lady dost protest too much." And what we see is that Paul protests too much in his writings. He feels the need to defend himself against various potential accusations that could be leveled against him. And this is, again, something which no legitimate prophet would ever do. For example, in these verses, he assures his listeners and his readers, he says, "My motives are pure." if he really is a true prophet from God, he doesn't have to excuse himself. He says that my interactions don't employ deception. So he says to them that when I've been teaching you and I speak to you, I'm not deceiving you. I'm not concerned with my own well-being. I preached even when I was being persecuted. He says, I'm not preaching on my own authority. I'm being sent by God. You never had any of the Jewish prophets in the Tanakh saying, listen, I'm not making these words up. This comes from God. They were saying as prophets, because they were established as prophets, they didn't have to apologize. Paul says that he didn't take the financial support that he was entitled to from his students, from his churches. And he insists that he had integrity, that he was holy, he was righteous, and he was blameless. And so this is very unusual that he spends, a number of verses here just going over and over and over again, his defending himself when he doesn't really have to defend himself if he is a true prophet. And it's interesting that in verse 9, the HCSB Study Bible says, it was clear that Paul was not in the ministry for the money. I mean, it's not so clear. It's just that Paul says this. But the HCSB Study Bible, I guess, takes him at his word. They say it was clear that Paul was not in the ministry for the money. And this helped testify to the truth of his messages. Now, we discussed this back in the previous session that we had, that someone's sincerity does not prove that what they're teaching is true. It doesn't have any bearing at all on the truth. Even if Paul did not take a penny for his teaching, it doesn't mean that what he was teaching was true. Meaning, Paul could have been totally sincere, but sincerely wrong. And that's obviously the case, that a person's sincerity does not prove that what they're teaching or what they're saying is true. Now, in verse 13, Paul is very thankful for the way the Thessalonians accepted his preaching. He's very, very happy and thrilled and thankful that his teachings received a positive reception by the Thessalonians. Now, the fact that he says this, he sort of, he's expressing his own inner joy and inner satisfaction. So it's very clear when you read that verse 13, that this is a personal letter that Paul is writing. It's very obviously a letter coming from Paul. This is not a divinely revealed text. It's obviously something which Paul feels very strongly about, and it's coming from inside of him. And the NASB, the New American Standard Study Bible, writes the following. They write that Gentiles, because again, they're commenting on this verse where Paul is so thankful for the fact that the Thessalonians accepted his preaching. So the NASB Study Bible says that Gentiles could contrast the pure word of God that transforms lives to the immorality of pagan religions. So they're explaining why the Gentile audiences of Paul would appreciate his preaching, because all they had been exposed to, their entire world, was pagan barbarism, and now they're receiving something that's more elevated spiritually. So they say that, of course, they would appreciate that. And then they go on to take a swipe at Judaism in this commentary. And they say, and the Jews, meaning the Jewish listeners of Paul, could contrast the love and grace of the gospel to the legalism and pride often produced by the Jewish religion. Now, there's an expression that we've all heard: people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And it's obvious, it's clear that there probably have been some prideful Jews. It's certainly not something which is impossible. But they didn't get there, meaning any Jews that are prideful did not get there by following the teachings of Judaism. Meaning what the NASB Study Bible says is that there's this pride produced by the Jewish religion. That's not true. Meaning none of the teachings of Judaism lead a person in the direction of pride. As a matter of fact, this demonstrates an incredible, abysmal ignorance of the teachings of Judaism, which emphasize almost more than anything else humility and the opposite of arrogance and the opposite of pride. And so if there have been Jews who've been prideful and who are prideful, it's not because they're following the teachings of Judaism. And by the same token, there have always been prideful and legalistic Christians. That much I know for sure. I've met them personally. Christians who are extremely legalistic and who are extremely prideful. There's sort of a pride that I'm saved and you're not. And, a certain, we've all met this. We've all met people like this. I'm not saying, God forbid this is true of all Christians, but there certainly are many Christians that suffer from pride and arrogance. And I would say one other thing, if we wanted to contrast, because that's what the NASB Study Bible is doing here, contrasting Christianity with Judaism, I would ask the question, which of these movements has produced followers who committed genocide? We don't see Jewish people over the course of their long history, a history longer than Christianity, engaging in genocide, in massive persecution of peoples, of raping cultures and destroying cultures. And unfortunately, that has been not uncommon in the 2,000-year history of Christianity. So again, people that live in glass houses should not throw stones. Now we get to the heart of this chapter, at least in terms of what I wanted to focus on in this session, which is verses 14 to 16. I want to read just the first two verses now, and then we'll proceed slowly. So verses 14 to 16. For you, brethren, became similar to the churches of God in Messiah Jesus that are in Judea. For you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews. Meaning, just to, I guess, flesh this out, he's speaking to the Thessalonians, and he's saying, just like you have been persecuted by your own countrymen. Now, it's not necessarily speaking about Jews that are persecuting them here in this this is not Israel. This is outside of Israel. This is Thessalonica. Presumably, it did not have a huge Jewish population. I don't think it did actually at that time. I think it had a very small Jewish population. So Paul is saying not that they endured sufferings from the Jews in their town, in their city. He's saying that they endured sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, which I would imagine is primarily non-Jews, and they were persecuted. And he's saying that just like the churches of Jews who follow Jesus in Judea were persecuted by the Jews, you're being persecuted by the people in your hometown. So let me read this sentence one more time. For you, brethren, became similar, just like the churches of God in the Messiah Jesus that are in Judea, for you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your countrymen, of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and drove us out, they are not pleasing to God, but hostile to all men. Now, this is part of a very ugly rant by Paul that really and frankly embarrasses many Christian readers. And because of this, commentaries sometimes struggle to take some of its rough edges off. Not all commentaries, as we'll see, some commentaries have no problem with reading this straight up. But let's first try to cover some of the commentaries who I think are embarrassed by this ugly rant by Paul. So the Zondervan Study Bible writes that Paul's harsh words stem from his frustration with fellow Jews who have threatened his Gentile mission. Now, that might be the case. He might have been frustrated. And of course, this kind of approach, which doesn't really excuse what Paul says, but what it really does is to negate any claim to divine revelation, meaning that the Zondervan Study Bible seems to be accepting the idea that this passage is a product of Paul and of Paul's aggravation and his frustration. He's not saying that this is a product of God's frustration, right? That they seem to be taking the view in their commentary, sort of excuse the viciousness of this prose because, what do you want? Paul's a human being, and he got frustrated and aggravated, and he's sort of taking it out on the Jews here, but, chalk it up to his frustration. But that certainly shoots the idea of divine revelation in the foot. Now, there's another Christian commentary that I wanted to look at called the Apologetic Study Bible. And they write the following: accusing Paul of anti-Semitism, of Jew hatred, misunderstands these verses because Paul was a Jew and many who followed Jesus were Jews. And so the Apologetic Study Bible seems to be saying that because Paul was a Jew, you can't accuse him of anti-Semitism. Now, that as if Jews cannot be anti-Semitic. The truth is, the ugly truth is that some of the most anti-Semitic people in history have been Jews who broke away from their people and proceeded to relentlessly attack their former co-religionists. Meaning that these are people that may have a Jewish identity card. They may be a Jew in terms of their status, but there's very little Jewish about them, meaning that they've basically cut their ties from the destiny and the people of Israel. I'll give a few examples. I was called a number of years ago by a family right here in Toronto whose son became a vicious neo-Nazi. And he physically assaulted his parents, and he would broadcast the most hateful canards imaginable about the Jewish people. He was certainly a vicious Jew hater, yet he was a Jew. Yusuf al-Khattab was born Joseph Leonard Cohen, and he converted to Islam in his late 20s. He became a jihadist, and he started an organization in New York called Revolution Muslim. Revolution Muslim, he started this organization in 2007, and it was an organization that had a website that was actively trying to recruit young American Islamic fanatics to join terrorist organizations, Islamic terrorist groups. And eventually, Yusuf al-Khattab was sentenced to prison for terrorist threats against Jewish people and Jewish institutions. William Porter Gale, who was born Jewish, publicized a satanic Jewish conspiracy to undermine the United States. And he founded a hate group called the Pasi Comitatus in the 1970s and 1980s. So again, someone who was born Jewish but became a rabid anti-Semite. Daniel Burroughs was born Jewish, and in 1960 he joined the American Nazi Party, and later he joined the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. Again, he himself became a rabid anti-Semite, a very hateful person, that tremendous hatred against his own people, but he was a Jew. Professor Norman Finkelstein, he was a professor at Brooklyn College, and I was once working at Brooklyn College. So his mother and stepfather were both Holocaust survivors, and yet he is a strident opponent of Israel. He expresses solidarity with both terrorist organizations, Hezbollah and Hamas, and he claims that the Holocaust has become an industry that exploits the Holocaust in order to help support Zionism. Again, someone that has incredibly negative views of the Jewish people, and yet he was born and raised as a Jew. And this is an old story. This is not just something in the 20th century and 21st century. Nicolas Donin from Paris converted to Christianity in the early 13th century. And he was a central figure in the 1240 disputation in Paris. There was a disputation where the rabbis were forced. They didn't want to debate the Christians. They knew that, if they won the debate, it would be bad news. And if they lost the debate, it would be bad news. And as a result of that disputation in Paris, 1240, 24 cartloads of Talmud were burnt. By the way, this is long before there was a printing press. So you can imagine, just to copy by hand one volume of the Talmud was very, very laborious. But 24 cartloads of volumes were burnt as a result of his participation in this disputation. There was someone named Moses Sephardi who was baptized in 1106. He became known as Petrus Alfonsi, and he wrote terrible propaganda tracts against Judaism and against the Talmud. Then you had in the 12th century Solomon Levy of Burgos, and he converted to Christianity. He became an archbishop known as Paul de Santa Maria, and he became the terror of the Jews of Spain. He went by the nickname Geronimo de Santa Fe, and again, he was a horrible Jew hater, even though he was born a Jew. One final example, again, but there are many I can bring. Joseph Pfefferkorn, who was baptized in 1505 in Bohemia, so he was active in publishing anti-Jewish literature, and he urged that the Jews of Germany be persecuted. And so this idea from this Christian study Bible, that just because Paul is a Jew, you cannot accuse him of being anti-Semitic, is absurd. Now, moving on to other commentaries that try to soften, this rant by Paul. So David Stern, in his Jewish New Testament commentary, tries to deflect the charge of anti-Semitism by insisting that Paul is not speaking about all Jews, even though he acknowledges that every single translation of the New Testament speaks about the Jews who killed Jesus and the prophets and drove us out and are not pleasing to God and are hostile to all men. The Jews. But David Stern insists that Paul is not really speaking about the Jews, but only about the Judeans, meaning that we know that one of the provinces of Israel was the province of Judea, which was where Jerusalem was. For example, that wouldn't include the Galilee, northern Israel. So he basically tries to say, well, it's not an attack against all Jews, just against Judeans. And it's interesting that the TLV translation of the New Testament, the Tree of Life version, which is basically a messianic translation, tries to further narrow Paul's accusation and Paul's vitriol by limiting it to not Judeans in general, but to Judean leaders. This is what they write. This is their translation. They say, "For you, brothers and sisters, became imitators of God's communities in Messiah Yeshua that are in Judea, for you suffered the same things at the hands of your own countrymen as they did from the Judean leaders, who killed both the Lord Yeshua and the prophets, and they were not pleasing to God and are hostile to all men." And this, again, has to be analyzed. Even if we want to squeeze this passage down in the narrowest fashion, is this really true that the leaders in Judea killed the prophets? They killed Jesus. They are not pleasing to God. They are hostile to all men. Is that true of all of the leaders, the Judean leaders? Now, we'll analyze this in a moment, but I just wanted to focus for a few minutes now on just one phrase here. This phrase that the Jews, or, who again want to narrow it down, the Judeans or the Judean leaders, killed the prophets. Now, this is a very, very famous accusation. It appears in the Quran, in Surah 2, paragraph 61, and it's actually repeated, I believe, 10 times in the Quran. And here, Paul throws this in the face of the Jewish people. And the question is, when this accusation is made, that the Jews killed the prophets, they murdered the prophets, so who were the prophets that were killed? I mean, that an accusation is being made here. Which prophets were actually killed, and who killed them? Now, are we to believe that all of the prophets were killed? Meaning that when the text here says that the Jews killed the prophets, that seems to imply that they killed all the prophets. It doesn't say they killed some prophets, they killed a few prophets. It's spoken very generally. They killed the prophets. Is that true? And when it says they, right, so the Jews, meaning all the Jews killed all the prophets, or all the Judeans killed all the prophets, or all the Judean leaders killed all the prophets? I mean, you have here language, unfortunately, that is very vague and is very easily taken in the most negative way possible, because it allows that kind of reading. So what actually happened in terms of the prophets being killed? So Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 30 refers to prophets being killed, but he doesn't mention who these prophets were. He doesn't mention who killed them. So Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, in his commentary written about 1,000 years ago, so Rashi says that he's referring to two people. He's referring to Zechariah ben Yehoiada, who we know was killed by Joash, and that is found in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 19 to 20. And Rashi says it also is referring to Uriah ben Shemaiah, who was killed by the wicked king Jehoiakim. And we see this in Jeremiah chapter 26, verses 20 to 24. So, so far, in terms of which prophets were killed, we have two, and killed by two kings. That would have been a very different thing to say, well, there were two prophets killed by two kings, rather than making a blanket accusation of the Jews killing the prophets. Now we also see another passage in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 4, and also the same idea is repeated in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 10 and 14, which speaks about Jezebel, who killed the prophets. So the question is, was she a Judean leader? Was Jezebel a Judean leader? So the truth is that Jezebel was the wife of King Ahab, and they were not Judean. They were from the northern kingdom of Israel, the Israelite kingdom. So this idea of trying to make it seem as if this accusation against the Jews really only applies to the Judean leaders is betrayed here, because here you see that most of the prophets that were killed, because she didn't just kill one or two people, she killed a lot of prophets. She was not Judean. As a matter of fact, Jezebel was not even Jewish. She was the daughter of the king of Sidon. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31. So it's not even a Jew here, not even an Israelite, that is responsible for the killing of these prophets. And so the truth is that not all the prophets were killed, and only a few Judean kings are implicated. Now, we actually see in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 13, that Obadiah saved 100 prophets. Not that the Jews were killing all the prophets. Here you see that there was someone that saved 100 prophets. And it's interesting that, even though people read the New Testament and have the impression that Jesus was constantly persecuted and didn't have any support, the truth is that we find in the Gospels themselves that some of the Pharisees tried to protect Jesus against the Romans. We see this in the book of Luke, chapter 13, verse 31, but this doesn't get a lot of play. This gets, forgotten very quickly. So while there were certainly some wicked kings, that is clear from reading the Hebrew Bible, they were not the real spiritual leaders of the Jewish people. The real spiritual leaders of the Jewish people were the sages, were the judges, were the teachers, people that would later be called the rabbis. But these are the actual leaders in terms of Judaism. The kings, we know, many of them were totally, they were idolaters. They rejected Judaism. So we don't want to judge Judaism by the actions of people who don't practice Judaism. There's an old saying, judge Judaism by Judaism, not by necessarily all the Jews who don't practice it properly. And so the question is, in terms of Jewish leadership, real Jewish leadership, did these Jewish leaders kill the prophets? The truth of the matter is that, quite the contrary, the real Jewish leadership, who were the sages, were the judges, they were the ones who validated the prophets. They were the ones who enshrined the prophets as true prophets, meaning that, as we mentioned before, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, we see that the only way someone can be accepted as a prophet is if they are accepted by the leading sages, the leading judges of the generation. So the leading authorities of the Jewish people in terms of Judaism, in terms of spirituality, they didn't, God forbid, kill the prophets. They were the ones that were that basically invested these prophets with authority and accepted them as legitimate. So again, what you see here is the New Testament is painting a very, very negative, hostile, nasty, ugly picture of the Jews, of the Jewish people. And again, as I mentioned before, all of the translations of the New Testament, except for these two messianic translations, David Stern's and the other one I mentioned, all of them translate Paul here as speaking about the Jews, in the generic sense. John MacArthur, I've quoted him many times, who's one of the leading Protestant evangelical scholars today. So in his commentary to 1 Thessalonians, he says the following. He says, there is no question that the Jews were responsible for the death of their Messiah. Though the Romans carried out the execution, it was the Jews who brought the case against him, and they demanded his death, just as they had killed the prophets. Now, what is John MacArthur saying? He's saying that the Jews as a people, the Jewish people as a people, killed Jesus, as a people killed their prophets. He doesn't say a few prophets. He doesn't say a few Jewish leaders. He actually takes the view, which is, again, what virtually all Christian translations do, which is it's the Jews, qua Jews, the Jews as a people, are responsible for killing Jesus and for murdering their prophets. And again, the reader doesn't understand necessarily that it's not referring to all prophets, and it's only referring to the few wicked kings that did kill these prophets. John MacArthur goes on to say in verse 16, just as it was God's will that all men be saved, so it was the will of the Jews that no one find salvation in Jesus. That somehow the entire Jewish people were invested in sabotaging the mission of Jesus. Now, it's very clear, not just to myself, but to numerous scholars, that it's passages like this in 1 Thessalonians, which basically tar the entire Jewish people with, again, the murder of the prophets. And, what it sounds like is all the prophets. And the murder of Jesus, the Jews are all responsible. And, one of the teachings in the Mishnah, in Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers, one of the great Jewish tracts on ethical behavior, it says that we have to be very careful with our words, especially they speak about chachamim, that, wise people should be very careful with what they say. Words matter. And what's problematic here is that the writer of this, Paul, doesn't say that, there was a small number of Jewish kings, maybe 2 or 3 from Judea, who killed the prophet, who killed some prophets. But he speaks about, again, even if you want to narrow this down as much as these partisan commentaries do, it gives the impression that it's all the Judean kings killing all the prophets. And the truth is that Paul does not qualify his words. Paul speaks very generically about the Jews, just like we know that the Gospel of John, of all the 4 Gospels, the most hateful gospel, speaks about the Jews. Again, generically. It's interesting that Christians might say that Paul did qualify this as those Jews who persecuted Christians. But it could also be understood to be saying that basically all Jews were guilty of persecuting Jesus. And so, the question is, if we're supposed to be careful with our words, we should think, how might someone take these words? Is someone going to assume, that Paul is only speaking about a handful of leaders? Or is someone going to take this in the broadest sense that, Paul is speaking about the Jews as a group, killing the prophets as a group? And this, I believe, is part of what becomes the New Testament's responsibility for 2,000 years of Jew hatred, meaning that the Christians have basically been nursed from their mother's milk, which is the New Testament, on a diet of hatred, a diet of slander, a diet of libel, a diet of canards against the Jewish people. And again, many scholars, many Christian scholars, have openly said that it would be impossible to imagine the Holocaust happening if you didn't have 2,000 years of Christian hatred of Jews. It's interesting that one of the most modern translations of the Christian Bible is the CEV, the Common English Bible, done in 2011. And listen to how they translate verse 15. Now, again, usually the more recent editions try to soften things. This is how they have verse 15. They killed both, they meaning the Jews, they killed both the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. They don't please God, and they are hostile to the entire human race. They are hostile to the entire human race. Who is that speaking about? Even if he's saying it's only speaking about Judeans, can we take that seriously? That all the Jews in Judea, none of them are pleasing to God,
right,
and all of them are hostile to the entire human race? It becomes very difficult to understand how someone can write something like this. And I think the problem is when we read passages like this in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, and we read passages like Matthew 23, which accuses the Jewish people of the murder of all the righteous people going all the way back to Abel. I mean, how is that possible? There were no Jews living at the time of Abel. And yet in Matthew 23, that's what Jesus accuses the Jewish people of, that you are responsible for the death of all the righteous people going back to Abel, the son of Adam. And passages like John chapter 8, verse 44, where Jesus says of the Jews, you are of your father, the devil. And so it's impossible to imagine that, without these passages, you would have had such incredible hatred of Jews for 2,000 years. And it's easy now to understand how it's possible to have Christians believing the kind of things they believed about the Jews, that Jewish people kill their children to use their blood for matzah, that Jewish people poison their wells, that Jewish people desecrate the host, that they would kidnap the crackers that are used in the mass, and they would take a little knives and they would stab the little pieces of wafer. If you just read the kind of things that Christians accused the Jewish people of and believed about the Jewish people, I think it's only possible that Christians believe these things because these are the kind of ugly things that are said about us in the Christian Bible. I have one more point to make and we'll wrap it up for tonight, where Paul says in verse 18 that, let me just read this verse. Paul says that, for we wanted to come to you, certainly I, Paul, did again and again, but Satan stopped us. So Paul says to the Thessalonians that he wanted to come to visit them, but Satan thwarted us. Satan stopped us. Now, this is a little bit of a problem because one of the claims that Christianity makes, based upon the way they read Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, is that Jesus came to crush the head of the serpent, which they see as Satan. Meaning that you find in Romans chapter 16, verse 20, that it says in Romans that God will crush Satan under your feet shortly. Now, why is Paul writing in Romans that God is going to crush Satan under your feet shortly? Obviously, Jesus didn't do it. And, you find in 1 John chapter 3, verse 8, it says that the Son of Man came to destroy the works of the devil. And in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14, that it says, through the death of Jesus might render powerless the devil. So clearly the Christian Bible teaches that the death of Jesus was supposed to render the power of Satan powerless, was supposed to basically negate the power of Satan, was supposed to crush the power of Satan. And yet you see here already in 1 Thessalonians that no, Satan's power was not crushed. He was preventing Paul from going about his business. And Paul actually writes about this in Romans, that it hasn't happened yet. God's going to have to do it soon. And soon, obviously, is very long because it still hasn't happened. It's 2,000 years later. And so this is, again, one of those promises that Christians believe was fulfilled with the advent of Jesus, but has not been fulfilled. And again, they're forced to rationalize this by saying it's going to happen at the second coming. But again, in the book of Hebrews, it doesn't say that Jesus will do this when he returns. It says through the death of Jesus, the power of the devil will become powerless. And so this is a problem that, again, we might get more into when we get to 1 John and the book of Hebrews. But I think that for tonight, that will be at least the introduction to this topic of New Testament anti-Judaism.
All right, very good. Well, it was definitely informative for sure. All right, so until I guess next week, guys. Rabbi, thank you so much for your time. You're always bringing some really interesting stuff to the table. I think a lot of people fail to see the first go around, so even the third and fourth go around for me. So it's unsettling to say the least, but it's there, and we just hey, got to take it one bite at a time, I guess.
That's a good way of putting it.
Very good. Okay, Rabbi. Well, you have a great week, and you all should do the same thing. And we'll, Hashem willing, we'll see you the same time, same place next week with just another episode of a Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament with Rabbi Michael Skobac. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay, God bless you.
You too. Shalom, shalom, everybody. Bye-bye.